Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to tackle something pretty big.
Yeah.
We're going to tackle a concept as old as humanity itself.
You've
thought about this. It's the idea of God.
It is.
It's massive, right? I mean, where do you even begin with a topic like this? But we are not aiming for like a dusty theological textbook here or anything like that.
Right.
Instead, we're going to kind of journey through the origins and the really surprising variations into just the lasting impact of this idea across different cultures throughout history.
Yeah, it's a fascinating journey, because when you think about it, everyone has their own idea of God.
Right.
Or no God. So to kind of guide our exploration for this topic, we have a pretty rich collection of sources that we've gathered.
Yeah.
But one in particular we'll be focusing on today is an analysis called, and this is kind of a mouthful, it's called AI Explores God, an anthropological analysis.
Right.
And what makes this source so interesting is its perspective. It has a very broad cross-cultural perspective. And that allows us to step back, and look at this concept, this idea of God through a wider lens, because it's such a personal concept, to many people.
Right.
But it's also a fundamental part of human experience.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of what we are going to try to do in this deep dive, is to bring it back from that kind of personal, individual level up to this macro level of like, wow, this is something that humans have been grappling with for a really long time.
It is.
So our goal today is to extract, I think, the most fascinating insights from this anthropological viewpoint and uncover some unexpected connections, maybe even some surprises for you along the way.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get started. Where do these enduring beliefs, these beliefs in God, where do they even begin to take shape?
Well, anthropology suggests that we look at the very early human attempts to just make sense of the world around them and their place within it. And it's a human drive, the search for understanding. The analysis points to something called animism as kind of a foundational form of this, which is the belief that spirits inhabit everything.
Right.
Not just living things, but also inanimate objects and natural forces.
Right, so like a tree, you could believe that a tree has a spirit in it.
A tree, a rock, a mountain,
Okay.
a river, and so on and so forth. Now, studies of hunter-gatherer societies, which in some ways mirror earlier human social structures, indicate that this kind of belief in spirits was widespread.
So if you were living back then, you might see a spirit not just in an animal, but also, like we said, in a river or a mountain or a tree.
That's right. That's a pretty fundamental way of interacting with the environment.
It is, yeah. Totally different from how most of us live today.
Exactly, yeah. Now the analysis goes a little bit deeper into a possible cognitive root for this tendency, for this animistic belief. And they point to something called the hyperactive agent detection device, or HADD for short. And essentially this HADD, it's a theory that our brains are wired to be incredibly sensitive to detecting intentions and agents in our surroundings, even when there's no definitive proof.
Right.
So this would have been very crucial for survival in the early days, like quickly spotting a predator hiding in the bushes.
Right.
But this same mechanism could also have led early humans to interpret unexplained natural phenomena as the actions of unseen spiritual beings.
Interesting.
Right. So like a sudden storm, a strange sound that could be interpreted as, oh, there must be some spiritual being doing this, A rustling in the leaves wasn't just the wind, it might be a spirit moving through them.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like better to overestimate the possibility that there is an agent there and be cautious than to not be cautious and then get eaten by a tiger.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, so the analysis then moves on to early burial practices. What can we learn from those?
Right. So the deliberate burial of the dead, along with grave goods, dating back to around 100,000 years. This is really significant evidence.
Okay.
Because this strongly hints at an early belief in some form of an afterlife.
Okay.
Right? Why else would you provide tools or offerings for the deceased unless you thought that they were going somewhere or continuing in some form?
Yeah, it seems very deliberate. You were burying somebody with all this stuff that they might need in an afterlife.
Exactly. And so this indicates that, very early on, humans were grappling with mortality.
Right.
And this likely played a role in the development of religious ideas that offer explanations for death and perhaps hope beyond it.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a human thing, right? To be faced with death, and not like the concept of death, but like, oh, wow, people that I know are dying.
Yeah.
And than to try to rationalize that or to come up with some sort of understanding of it.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got facing our own mortality and wondering what happens next. That seems like a pretty powerful push towards these early beliefs. And from individual spirits and concerns about the afterlife, we then see the emergence of what's called totemism in tribal societies.
Exactly, exactly. So as human societies became more structured, so did their religious expressions.
Okay.
Right. And totemism is this idea where a group or a clan, they identify with a particular symbol. Yeah. And it's often an animal or a plant.
Okay.
Think of like a family crest or something like that,
Right.
And thinkers like Emil Durkheim and W. Robertson Smith, these anthropologists, they propose that totemism wasn't simply about worshiping the symbol itself, but rather it was about the social group and their shared ancestry that the totem represented.
Okay, so it was about the people, the tribe, the family.
It was about the people. It was a way of embodying their collective power, their identity. So it really underscores how, even in the very beginnings, religion served to create a sense of us.
Right.
And it strengthened social bonds. It brought people together.
That's interesting. So the focus wasn't just on a personal connection to something supernatural, but also on how these beliefs could bind the community together.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so we are moving through time now. Following that, we see ancestor worship emerging. How does that fit in?
Well, building on the idea of an afterlife, ancestor worship developed.
Okay.
And this involves, venerating deceased relatives who were believed to continue to play an active role in the lives of the living.
Right.
Right. So even though they were gone physically, spiritually, they were still there and they were still influencing events.
I see. Okay.
And this highlights, the enduring importance of kinship ties, the family and the human desire to maintain connections to the past. You can see how this focus on the continued presence and influence of ancestors could have gradually paved the way for beliefs in more powerful anthropomorphic deities, those with human-like qualities and defined roles.
Okay, so we have seen a progression here. We have seen from, spirits in the natural world to the worship of social groups through totems, and then to the veneration of those who came before us, our ancestors. What's the next major step in this evolution of how we have conceived of the divine?
Well, the analysis points to the rise of polytheism
Okay.
in more complex civilizations like ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. So instead of a diffuse array of spirits, you start to see kind of organized pantheons of gods and goddesses, each with specific domains and personalities and powers, often linked to different aspects of nature or human life,
Right.
Think of like the Greek pantheon with Zeus ruling the sky and Poseidon the sea, or the Hindu pantheon with its multitude of deities representing various aspects of the cosmos.
So it's almost like this divine division of labor,
Yes, exactly.
like with different gods being in charge of different things. And it seems like a more structured way of trying to understand a very complex world.
It is. And, this likely mirrored the increasing specialization and complexity within human societies themselves.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right. So as roles became more defined in human communities, so too did the roles of the supernatural entities that they imagined.
Yeah, like if you had somebody who was in charge of keeping track of the grain, you might invent a god who's in charge of grain.
Precisely. And then, a really significant shift occurs, which is the emergence of monotheism.
Right, the belief in a single god.
A single god, exactly.
And the analysis highlights Zoroastrianism and early Judaism as key examples of this that eventually lead to the development of Christianity and Islam. That's a huge change from having a whole cast of divine characters.
It is a radical shift, and monotheistic religions typically ascribe a core set of attributes to this single god, being all-knowing, which is omniscient, all-powerful, which is omnipotent, perfectly good, which is omnibenevolent, and present everywhere, which is omnipresent. So this move towards a unified conception of the divine, might be connected to evolving social structures as well.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, perhaps the consolidation of political power under a single ruler,
Oh, okay.
So a single supreme deity kind of reflects that.
Interesting, that parallel, that societal shifts and how we see God, that kind of go hand in hand.
There's a definite connection there. And, the analysis also touches on some of the evolutionary and cognitive theories that offer another perspective on why these beliefs might have arisen.
Yeah, let's dig into that a little bit because I find that really interesting.
Yeah.
The evolutionary side of things.
Yeah. So, the significant increase in human brain size over, hundreds of thousands of years, this gave us the capacity for much more complex, abstract thought.
Right?
Right. So, we were able to ponder concepts like mortality and just the nature of existence.
Yeah, and it's not just about, like, how do we build a better hut?
Yeah.
Like, what is all of this about?
What is all of this about? And, cognitive abilities like theory of mind,
Right.
which is our understanding that other people have their own thoughts and beliefs and intentions.
Right.
Right. So we're not just reacting to the world. We are understanding that other people are also experiencing it and thinking about it.
Yeah.
And then, of course, our friend HADV.
Right.
Right. This hyperactive agent detection. All of this likely played a role in our tendency to perceive agency in the world and form beliefs about supernatural beings.
I see. So this idea that our brains are getting bigger, more complex. And as they do so, they're opening up all these possibilities in terms of how we understand the world and our place in it.
That's right. That's right. And then, on top of that, there's the naturalness of religion thesis,
Okay.
which suggests that belief in supernatural agents isn't some kind of strange anomaly in human thought, but rather a natural byproduct of how our brains are structured and how we perceive the world,
Right.
And the analysis also mentions how minimally counterintuitive concepts tend to be more memorable and spread more easily within a culture.
What's a minimally counterintuitive concept?
So these are ideas that are mostly familiar and make sense, but they contain a few unexpected elements.
Okay.
Right? Think of like a ghost that looks like a person but can walk through walls.
Right.
That's minimally counterintuitive.
Right.
It's familiar enough to grasp, but it has that little weird element.
Right. And you're getting to remember it because it's a little weird.
Exactly. And the analysis also brings up the potential role of dreams and altered states of consciousness.
Right.
Because these kinds of experiences could have certainly contributed to early beliefs about supernatural realms and encounters with divine beings. In a vivid dream, you might interact with loved ones who have passed away or experience events that defy the normal laws of reality.
Right.
So it kind of blurs the lines between the everyday world and something beyond.
Yeah. It's interesting that you bring that up because so many religious traditions have some component of dreams in them or visions or some kind of altered state.
That's right. So when you piece it all together, this concept of God in its broadest sense, it appears to have incredibly deep roots in our history, in our cognitive makeup, in our social development.
Yeah. And it makes sense, right?
It does.
That we would come up with these ideas and that they would stick around. Now, the term God can feel almost universal, but the analysis really highlights the vast and fascinating spectrum of interpretations that exist. So let's delve into some of those different perspectives, starting with the monotheistic faiths we've mentioned.
Yeah, and the analysis does a great job here of outlining the nuances between these different faiths.
Yeah.
So Judaism, as one of the oldest monotheistic traditions,
Right.
it centers on the strict monotheism of Yahweh, a singular, indivisible, perfect, moral God who is both transcendent, meaning beyond our complete comprehension.
But also personal, actively involved in the world and in the lives of individuals.
So both at the same time.
Both.
Okay.
Both beyond us, but also present with us.
Interesting.
Right.
Okay. So then we have Christianity, which, while sharing that core belief in one God, introduces a very complex doctrine.
Right.
The Trinity.
The Trinity.
Which is one God existing in three co-equal persons, the Father, the Son, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit.
Exactly.
That's a key theological distinction.
It is. And, this concept of the Trinity is what fundamentally distinguishes Christianity from that strict monotheism of Judaism and Islam.
Okay.
So speaking of Islam, the central tenet there is the absolute oneness or tawhid of Allah.
Right.
The all-powerful, all-knowing creator and judge of the universe.
Okay.
And Islam very strictly rejects any partners or multiple forms of God, including the Christian Trinity. Right. So while these faiths share a common Abrahamic heritage and many core beliefs, there are these really fundamental differences in how they understand the nature of the divine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But the analysis points out some important shared attributes as well,
Yeah. What are those?
Despite these distinct theological frameworks, they generally agree on God being eternal, omnipotent, omniscient, the ultimate creator of the universe,
Right.
and possessing fundamental attributes like holiness, justice, and perfect goodness. So it's almost like different cultures and traditions have focused on and interpreted different facets of a single, incredibly complex idea.
Right, right. It's like if you imagine this multifaceted jewel that each of these traditions is holding up one side to the light and saying, look how this sparkles.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, so let's shift our focus a little bit here. Let's talk about polytheistic religions. Hinduism, with its massive, intricate pantheon of deities. This is a prime example, I think.
It is, and it's a fascinating case study. And while there are indeed countless gods and goddesses,
Right.
many of these are understood as different manifestations or aspects of this ultimate, formless, and all-pervading divine reality known as Brahman.
Okay.
Right? So Brahman is the ultimate source, and these gods are kind of emanations of that.
Okay.
And then you have these major deities like Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the preserver, Shiva, the destroyer,
Right.
and they represent these fundamental cosmic functions and the cyclical nature of the universe itself.
Right. So it's polytheistic, but there's also this underlying sense of unity, of interconnectedness.
Exactly. Exactly. And we also have the ancient Greek and Roman religions with their very human-like gods and goddesses who played such a prominent role in their cultures.
Right, yeah. Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Aphrodite.
Exactly.
And it's interesting how they each have their own specific domains of influence. They've got their own distinct personalities, and they intervene in human affairs, often with, as you said, very human motivations and even flaws. And it's a very different feel compared to the more transcendent and often less directly anthropomorphic god of monotheism.
Exactly.
It's almost as if these deities were kind of personifications of natural forces and human experiences,
Right.
making the divine more relatable.
Yeah. Yeah. You could identify with these gods in a way that's harder with this more abstract, transcendent god. Now, the analysis also introduces some alternative conceptions of the divine that fall outside these traditional categories, like pantheism.
Right.
Pantheism, it blurs the lines between the divine and the universe itself.
Okay.
It proposes that reality in its entirety. Nature, the cosmos, everything that exists, it's identical with divinity.
Okay.
There isn't a separate transcendent God out there, but rather the divine is immanent, present within and throughout all things.
So God is everything and everything is God.
In essence, yes. And then there's panentheism, which sounds very similar, but there's a subtle but significant distinction.
Okay.
With panentheism, the universe is within God, but God is also greater than and transcends the universe. So the universe is a part of God, but God isn't limited to the universe.
Okay.
It's a more encompassing, expansive view.
It's like God is the ocean, and the universe is like a wave in the ocean.
Perfect analogy. Perfect analogy.
And the analysis even touches on non-theistic perspectives, such as Taoism. How does the concept of God fit into a philosophy like that?
Well, Taoism, with its central concept of the Tao, which is often translated as the way, it offers a fundamentally different approach to ultimate reality.
Yeah.
The Tao is understood as the underlying principle and source of all that exists. It's this eternal, ineffable order of the universe. It's not typically conceived of as a personal God that you would worship, but rather a principle to be understood and to be lived in accordance with.
So it's less about a being and more about just kind of the way things are.
Precisely. Now, while Taoism does have deities within its tradition, they're generally seen as manifestations of the Tao itself. And, this really underscores just this incredible diversity in how human thought has grappled with this concept of ultimate reality.
Yeah, and we see that over and over, I think, in this deep dive, that it's such a personal thing, and there's just so many different ways of approaching it. Okay, so we've talked about some different religious conceptions. Now, philosophers have also spent millennia wrestling with this concept of God.
Oh, yeah.
What are some of the key philosophical perspectives that the analysis touches on?
Well, you've got classical theism,
Okay.
which presents a very traditional and influential philosophical understanding of God. It posits God as this ultimate reality, possessing a very specific set of attributes, like aseity, which means that God is self-existent. It doesn't depend on anything else for its existence. Divine simplicity, which suggests that God's attributes aren't distinct parts, but rather God is each of those attributes. God is goodness, God is wisdom, and so on. Eternality, which means that God exists outside of time. immutability, which means God is unchanging. And, of course, the big ones, omnipotence, omniscience, and perfect goodness.
Right. And so these are the big ideas about God that have shaped so much of Western philosophical and theological thought.
Exactly. And the analysis mentions some of the classic arguments that philosophers have put forward to try to prove God's existence within this framework.
Right. What are some of those?
Yeah, so there's the ontological argument,
Okay.
which in its various forms attempts to demonstrate God's existence simply from the concept of a perfect being.
Okay.
So if you can imagine a perfect being,
Yeah.
that being must exist because existence is a perfection.
Okay.
Then you have the cosmological argument,
Okay.
which argues that the universe must have a first cause.
Right.
And that uncaused first cause is God.
Okay.
And then you have the teleological argument, which points to the apparent order, complexity, and design of the universe as evidence for an intelligent designer.
Okay.
So those are kind of the big three.
Right. And those are arguments that have been debated and refined by thinkers for centuries.
Centuries, yeah. And the analysis contrasts this kind of classical view with more contemporary perspectives, such as process theology.
Right.
So process theology offers a very different perspective
Okay.
on God's nature. It views God as dynamic and interactive with the universe,
Okay.
actually being affected by the events and processes that occur. So rather than being all powerful in a coercive sense,
Okay.
God's power is seen as more persuasive,
Okay.
offering possibilities and influencing the universe through love and relationship, rather than just dictating every outcome. So it's a much more relational and evolving view.
So rather than being this kind of static God that created the universe and then stepped back, it's like God is participating in the unfolding of everything.
Exactly.
Okay, that's interesting. And then, of course, we have atheistic perspectives,
Right.
which represent a rejection of theism in general.
That's right. And atheism, broadly speaking, is the disbelief or lack of belief in the existence of God or gods.
Okay.
And the analysis highlights some common arguments put forward by atheists, like a lack of empirical evidence for God's existence, the problem of evil, how can there be a God if there's so much suffering in the world?
Right.
And the perceived logical inconsistencies within theistic doctrines, and then also the increasing explanatory power of science,
Right.
So it's important to distinguish between different forms of atheism, you know.
Yeah, that's some of those.
Well, strong atheism or positive atheism
Okay.
asserts that there is no God,
Okay.
whereas weak or negative atheism simply lacks a belief in God. They don't say definitively there is no God, they just don't believe that there is one.
Right.
And then you have agnostic atheism, which acknowledges that we may not be able to definitively know whether God exists,
Right.
but they still don't believe.
Okay.
And the analysis also briefly touches on the complex relationship between faith and reason.
Yeah, that's a big one.
It is. These are two fundamental ways that we as humans approach understanding the world and the possibility of something beyond.
Right.
So faith often involves belief that goes beyond empirical evidence.
Right.
Right. So sometimes it's rooted in personal experience, intuition, or just trust and tradition,
Okay.
whereas reason emphasizes logical thought, analysis, and evidence-based conclusions.
Okay.
And there's a whole range of views on how these two interact.
Yeah, I mean, are they diametrically opposed?
Yes.
Or can they work together?
Exactly. Some people see them as fundamentally opposed. Other people think they can be complementary ways of knowing.
Okay.
And still others prioritize one over the other.
Right.
So it's a deeply personal and ongoing intellectual discussion with a very long history.
Yeah. This is a really fascinating part of it, I think, to me, this question of faith versus reason. Because, a lot of times people, especially in the West, they really kit these two things against each other. It's like you have to choose one or the other. But I think so many people actually live their lives in this kind of gray area where they're using both.
Exactly.
Okay. So let's shift from these philosophical ideas to their real-world impact. The analysis explores the enduring influence of this concept of God on societies and cultures throughout history. And let's start with the sociological functions of religion, often centered around this idea of the divine.
Yeah. So from a sociological perspective,
Yeah.
religion with God often at its center,
Right.
it provides a framework for meaning and purpose.
Right.
It helps individuals and communities make sense of their existence and their place in the cosmos. And it also plays a role in reinforcing social unity and stability.
Right.
Right? So you have these shared beliefs and values and rituals and moral codes
Right.
that kind of bind people together.
So it's not just about the individual belief, it's about how it fits into society.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, it creates a sense of belonging and community. And, you know, religion can also function as a form of social control, right? Promoting certain behaviors and discouraging others.
Right, if you think you're going to be punished by God.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, divine reward and punishment.
It can be a powerful motivator.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And the analysis also mentions the psychological benefits
Hmm.
that faith in God or a higher power can often provide.
Yeah. Yeah, and numerous studies have shown that there's a link between religious belief and practice
Right.
and greater psychological well-being.
Go.
This can include, you know, providing comfort in times of difficulty, reducing anxiety and depression, offering coping mechanisms for dealing with stress and loss,
Right.
and fostering a sense of purpose and moral guidance.
So that kind of social support,
Mm-hmm.
that sense of belonging can be a really powerful force.
It is. It is.
And, you know, when we look at history, the impact of religion, often centered on a particular conception of God, is undeniable. I
Right.
mean, you can't really avoid it.
You can't. You can't. For example, in medieval Europe, you know, the church was a central institution.
It was, yeah.
And it permeated every aspect of society.
That did, yeah.
From law and governance to education and art and just the very structure of daily life.
Right.
You know? And across ancient civilizations, religious beliefs deeply shaped governance, legal systems, social norms.
Right.
Think of like divine kingship in ancient Egypt.
Right.
Or the influence of religious law in various cultures. And, you know, religion has been this profound source of inspiration
Yeah.
for artistic and architectural expression throughout history, from grand cathedrals to temples, countless works of art. It even played a significant role in the development of universities,
Wow.
you know, as centers of learning.
Yeah, and so it's woven into every part of history.
It really is.
And the analysis also touches on the ethical frameworks
Mm-hmm.
that have developed within major world religions, often stemming from their core beliefs about God.
Yeah, and each religious tradition has developed a comprehensive ethical system, you know, that provides guidance for adherents on how they should live their lives and interact with others.
Okay.
You know, whether it's the Christian emphasis on love, compassion, and forgiveness, or the Islamic focus on justice and submission to God, care for the community, or the Hindu concepts of dharma and karma, you know, duty and action and consequence, the Buddhist principles of nonviolence, compassion, and ethical conduct, the Jewish emphasis on justice, righteousness, loving kindness, you know, it goes on and on.
And connect on a deeper level.
We can always hope.
Until next time.
See you then.
This is DigitView.